Condoleezza Rice, who are the extraordinary, ordinary people you write about in your memoir?
I write about my parents, John and Angelena Rice, and their parents, and our little community in Birmingham, Alabama. But it's really the story of my parents, who were ordinary people. My father was a high school guidance counselor, Presbyterian minister, later a university administrator. My mother was a school teacher. And so in that sense, they were ordinary. I doubt they ever made $60,000 between them. But they were extraordinary in the circumstances in which they lived, Jim Crow, Birmingham, Alabama, and also in the way that they responded to those circumstances with perseverance and toughness, and having their little girl know that if she could just get educated, she could do just about anything.
What was their backgrounds?
My mom came from a family her father was a coal mining engineer and built houses on the weekend. He was a real entrepreneur. There's a picture in the book of his truck, Albert Ray and Sons, and so he went around just kind of fixing everything. And my grandmother was a homemaker, deeply religious, devout woman who played the piano and taught piano lessons for 25 cents a lesson. And it's thanks to her that I actually learned to play the piano, because I stayed at her house during the day while my parents worked, and she taught me piano. On my father's side, and they were, by the way, my mother's parents, landowning, proudly landowning, and built their own house with their own hands. On the other side, my grandparents were John and Teresa Rice. John Wesley Rice Sr. was a particularly interesting man. He married my half-Creole grandmother when she was 17 and then took her off on a mission of educational evangelism all over Louisiana and Alabama and Mississippi. So they were born to, my parents, to this dignity and pride that their parents had exhibited.
You were born in November 1954, grew up in segregated Birmingham, Alabama. What was life like in the late 50s, early 60s in Birmingham?
Well, Birmingham, and it was the most segregated big city in America. You lived in kind of parallel societies. We didn't really know white people. I say in the book that we just called him the white man. It was a kind of depersonalized noun. And I lived in a very nice black middle-class community called Titusville, a suburb of Birmingham. Almost everybody in my community taught school. There was one lawyer, there was one doctor, everybody else taught school. You were faithful to church, that's where you had to be every Sunday. You were faithful to family, and the parents of that community were determined that their kids would be well educated as a kind of armor against the segregation, because you couldn't go to a restaurant, you couldn't go to an amusement park, you couldn't go to a theater. And yet, even though I couldn't have a hamburger at the Woolworth's lunch counter, my parents had me convinced I could be president of the United States if I wanted to be.
September 15th, 1963, what happened?
Birmingham, before 1962, 1963, was segregated, and the civil rights movement was percolating. But in 1963, Birmingham became known as Bombingham, because bombs were going off in neighborhoods all the time. One went off in our neighborhood a few doors down. And then on September 15th, 1963, at the 16th Street Baptist Church, homegrown terrorists set a bomb in the bathroom in the basement. And 4 little girls were killed there just on their way to Sunday school. And I can remember so well the day that it happened, because my father was, of course, a minister, and so we had gone up to the church. My mother was the choir master, and so we'd gone up to the church to get ready for service, and all of a sudden there was this loud thud, and we knew a bomb had gone off. You just knew that in Birmingham in those days, but we thought maybe in our community. And within a little while, Mrs. Florence Rice came in. She was my father's cousin by marriage. She came in and she said 16th Street Church had been bombed. A little while later, we knew the names of the little girls who had been killed. And Denise McNair, who was one of those little girls, had been a family friend, kindergarten friend. There's a picture in the book of my father giving her graduation diplomacy from kindergarten. So it was a very sad and in many ways terrifying day for our community.
What were some of the daily reminders before 1964, 1965 growing up that it was a segregated town and that you were African American?
Well, of course, you couldn't go any place that was a public accommodation, including, by the way, I didn't have a white classmate till we moved to Denver when I was 12 years old. But there were sometimes little spikes. For instance, we went to visit Santa Claus. You know how it is. All little kids go to visit Santa Claus. You go to the department store, you stand in line, and then you tell Santa Claus what you want. And as I was approaching the line, my father had noticed that the Santa Claus that particular day was taking the little white kids and putting them on his knee and taking the little black kids and holding them out here. And I heard him say to my mother, Angelena, if he does that to Condoleezza, I'm going to pull all that stuff off him and show him just to be the cracker that he is. And you're a little girl and kind of going for it with trepidation. Is Daddy going to go off? Is Santa Claus going to go off? What's going to be the scene here? And so here we have this racial incident around, of all things, Santa Claus. But it was also a constant reminder in everything from what was on television. The only black people on television were Amos and Andy with their butchered English. And it was a constant reminder because my parents, who never failed to tell me the stories of segregation, related those stories, like the one when my father and mother went to get registered to vote. And my mother was very fair-skinned and very pretty, and she was told by the poll tester, because in Dixiecrat, Alabama, there were poll testers for blacks. He looked at her and he said, so, you're a school teacher? And she said, yes. And he said, then you probably know who the first president of the United States was. And she said, yes, George Washington. He said, fine, go vote, or go register. Then he looked at my father, dark-skinned man, big, with a lot of kind of intimidating girth. And he said to my father, how many beans are in that jar? And there were hundreds of beans. And so my father had no idea. So he felt very bad. He went back to his church. And Mr. Frank Hunter said to him, an old man in the church, don't worry, Reverend. I know how to get you registered to vote. He said, there's a clerk down there, and she's a Republican. And she'll register anybody who'll say they're a Republican, because in those days in Birmingham, Democrats ruled. So my father went down. He said he was a Republican. He registered to vote, and he was, to the end of his life, a committed Republican. But that just demonstrated how hard it was in Birmingham, Alabama, for a big southern city in our country, for blacks to exercise their very simple right to vote.
Traveling while black.
Traveling while black. Well, you got in the car really, really early in the morning, hoping to get out of the deep south. If you were going, as we were, to New York, for instance, hoping to get out of the deep south before it got too dark, because you didn't want to be on the back roads of Mississippi or Georgia in the dark. And you packed that morning a picnic lunch, as my mom called it, chicken and pork chops and potato chips, things that wouldn't spoil, because you had to make it all the way to Washington, D.C. before you could stop at a restaurant. And of course, you couldn't stay in a hotel, so you slept overnight in the car. And most problematic was that the bathrooms, which were segregated for coloreds and for whites, the colored bathroom was always pretty filthy. And so, as I say in the book, if you had to go, you just went in nature, because it was really a trial. And later on, of course, you could stay in those new places called Holiday Inns that were really special. But traveling in the South before 1964, if you were a black family, was pretty tough.
Your first experience after the signing of the civil rights legislation in 1964?
My parents and I always watched the evening news, and our favorite was Huntley Brinkley Report.
They come up quite a bit in your
Oh,
book.
yeah, they were great. We watched every single night the Huntley Brinkley Report. As a matter of fact, they were my education in politics and history all the way through my life and as a child. And that particular night, in July of 1964, they reported that the Civil Rights Act had been signed by President Johnson. And then the local anchor came on after and said the so-called Civil Rights Act had just passed. So my parents and I, a couple days later, decided that we were going to go out and test this new Civil Rights Act. So we went to a restaurant in a hotel nearby. And the people looked up. I mean, we walked in, and it was like something out of a movie. They just looked up and stopped eating.